Germany is credited with capitulating France in June of 1940 after an invasion that lasted just a month and a half. In May of 1940, German forces invaded the Low Countries in order to bypass France's solid chain of fortifications known as the Maginot Line. What is often overlooked, however, is the Italian invasion of France that took place in 1940 across the Alpine mountains situated on the Franco-Italian border. The Italian invasion of France was important because it showed the imperial ambitions of fascist Italy during the 1930s and 40s, and it also foreshadowed the Italian military failures that would come later in the war due to inadequate equipment and aircraft supplied to Italy's soldiers. Before addressing the Italian invasion, it is necessary to explain why Italy joined the war against the Allies. Mussolini, the Italian dictator from 1922 and up until his arrest in 1943, had wanted to end French and British dominance over the Mediterranean and create somewhat of a modern Roman Empire. Controlling Gibraltar, Sudan, Egypt, and French North Africa, as well as having influence over the Balkans, were Italy's imperial ambitions. Italy and Germany had signed the Pact of Steel in May 1939, which was a military alliance against the French and British. Both Italy and Germany knew a war was inevitable, but the pact did not have a specific date for war with the Allies. Both Italy and Germany had different outlooks on when the war would occur. The Italians had assumed a war would take place in 1942 at the earliest. Germany had different plans and declared war on Poland in 1939. The Italian declaration of war on the Allies was politically motivated. By late May 1940, Mussolini was certain that France and Britain would soon surrender after Germany's encirclement of Dunkirk and their advance into France. Although Mussolini was concerned of the ill-prepared military and economy, he did not expect much fighting to be done by the Italians. He was certain that the Allies would soon surrender. The entrance into the war was opportunistic, and Mussolini believed he could conquer lots of land for Greater Italy. He was still overconfident in his military's capabilities despite the following degrading factors. Italian divisions were severely under strength. By June 1940, the Italian army had mobilized 1.5 million soldiers. The first problem was that only 19 of the 73 total divisions had 100% of their equipment. 20 divisions were at 70% strength, and 34 had less than 50% of their equipment. Much of the Italian military equipment was World War I era, adding to their problems. The Italian industry was weighed down by financial issues and could not sustain the large army Mussolini demanded. On May 26th, Mussolini told two of his top commanders, Marshal Pietro Badoglio and Italo Balbo, that he planned to join Germany against Britain and France. Both commanders advised strongly against this, arguing that the Italian military was in no position to wage a war with the Allies. Regardless of what his advisors told him, there was no stopping Mussolini's pride and impatience. The Italian military would have only 2 weeks to prepare before war would be declared, far from enough time to finish preparations. On June 5th, Mussolini went as far as to say, "I only need a few thousand dead, so that I can sit at the peace conference as a man who has fought." Adding to the concern of the Italian military leadership was that it would be extremely difficult to advance through the unforgiving mountains along the Franco-Italian border. Only a few mountain passes were suitable for motorized vehicles, and even if the Italians did send their trucks and tanks through the narrow passes, they were sure to get bombarded by French artillery. Furthermore, the French had constructed the Alpine line, a chain of fortifications along their border with Italy. France had already prepared to take a defensive stance, as they did not have the resources to push into Italy. The Italians had also planned to battle defensively, but later in the war, Mussolini would order an offensive. It would be the Italians who would be shot as they crossed the unforgiving terrain of the Alps. The King of Italy, Victor Emmanuel III, held control of the Italian military. On May 29th, in order to prepare himself for war, a prideful Mussolini was granted control of the Italian armed forces from the king. In the afternoon of June 10th, the same day the French government evacuated Paris, Italy declared war on France and Britain. The French ambassador described the Italian declaration as, "It is a dagger thrust into a fallen man." 4 days later, Paris would be captured by the seemingly unstoppable Germans. On the Franco-Italian border, the Italians had stationed 300,000 soldiers, organized into 22 divisions in 2 armies. The Italian Fourth Army was stationed in the northern section of the front, and the First Army held positions in the south. In reserve was the Italian Seventh Army. The Italians were also supported by 3,000 artillery pieces, 70 Type M11/39 medium tanks, and over 100 L3/35 tankettes. These tankettes had poor armor and were only armed with a machine gun. Many other tanks of the time outclassed both of these Italian tank models. Just like other aspects of the Italian military, their artillery was outdated, with many guns being World War I era. The Italians also lacked modern aircraft. The most common sight in the Italian Air Force was the CR-42 biplane. Although these were excellent biplanes, more modern monoplanes often outperformed them. They had only manufactured 165 modern aircraft. On the other hand, the French assigned only 85,000 soldiers to the front with Italy, with a reserve force of around 100,000 men. These French reservists were older, had not received modern equipment, and had less combat training. Both sides enlisted elite troops equipped for mountain combat. The French assigned 84 fighters, 20 reconnaissance planes, 68 bombers, 38 torpedo bombers, and 33 other aircraft to the Alpine region. This number was contrary to Italian intelligence, who believed the Allies had over 2,600 aircraft in the region. They also drastically overestimated the amount of French soldiers in the Alpine region, estimating that there were double the amount of French soldiers than there actually was. Although Mussolini desperately wanted to gain ground, the Italians initially took a defensive stance. After the fall of the French government on June 15th, however, Mussolini rushed to make gains before the French surrendered to the Germans. Mussolini was impatient and didn't want to take into account his unprepared military. He ordered that an offensive take place by the 18th of June. Marshal Badoglio protested, arguing that it would take over 3 weeks to prepare an offensive. A day later, on the 16th, Marshal Rodolfo Graziani ordered that offensive preparations take place for a future offensive that was to take place within 10 days. This did not give much time for preparations. The Italians planned to attack in the north through the mountain passes and along the coast. By the 17th, Italian commanders believed the French army of the Alps were incompetent due to the German threat to the north. They thought the French were evacuating, but in reality, they weren't. Along with this, due to the fall of Paris just a few days prior, the Italians believed the French morale would be so low that they could not put up an adequate defense. Yes, the French morale was low, but they would still put up a fight. On the 19th, Italian forces were ordered to harass the French as harshly as possible. Mussolini had ordered his forces to launch a major offensive on the 21st of June in an attempt to capture as much land as possible, with one major goal being the city of Nice on the Mediterranean coast. The Italian First Army, stationed on the southern part of the front, was tasked with occupying the French city of Nice, over 25 kilometers west of the border. The Italians held a reassuring numerical advantage, as they had double the amount of soldiers stationed on this part of the front compared to the French. Although the main attack came in the north, by the Italian Fourth Army, Mussolini himself ordered for the First Army to attack regardless of the casualties or danger. He wanted to see his soldiers storm into the city of Nice. On June 21st, the Italians began their offensive. On this day, and following into the 22nd and 23rd, the Italians were covered by fog, allowing them to advance undetected by French Alpine forts that could obliterate Italian units using their artillery. The Italians arrived on the outskirts of the city of Menton on the morning of the 23rd. After a fierce day of fighting, the Italians managed to dislodge the French defenders and captured Menton, advancing a total of around 5 kilometers. The Italians suffered heavy casualties, and Menton was the most populated city they captured during the campaign. During this time, storms on the Mediterranean coast prevented an amphibious landing by the Italians. Towards the north, elements of the Italian First Army launch a disastrous attack. Heavy storms slow the Italians down, and they lose 11 artillery pieces and count 235 casualties, mostly due to frostbite. Meanwhile, the Italian Fourth Army was stationed in the northern section of the front, tasked with capturing border towns and then advancing towards Albertville, around 30 kilometers west of the border. The army was split up into two groups, the Alpine Corps in the north and the First Corps in the south. The Alpine Corps pushed through the Little St. Bernard Pass, which was one of the few passes suitable for motor vehicles. Along the entire front, demolished bridges slowed the Italian advance and made it easier for the French to pin down Italian forces. Due to French forts, several Italian L3 tankettes were destroyed, and they suffered moderate casualties. Due to their race against time before the French signed an armistice with the Germans, the Alpine force was only able to advance about 8 kilometers. The mountain passes were a killing zone, as the French could concentrate their artillery on the narrow roads. Further south, the First Corps had the task of capturing border towns and then advancing towards Albertville. The first objective was a town called Modane, about 7 kilometers away from the border. The forces attacking Modane split up into 3 groups, the western, center, and eastern groups. It would be a 3-pronged attack towards Modane. Initially, the center attack group met fierce resistance on the Ambin and Belicom rivers, but other elements of the Italian force managed to flank across the rivers. The force then captured the town of Brahms after bombarding the defenses. After that, they advanced towards Modane. Meanwhile, the Eastern force captured numerous towns and later held the support of elements from the center attack group. During the advance, the Italians suffered many losses. After capturing numerous border towns, the Eastern and Center groups linked up for a final attack on Modane. They successfully destroyed the first line of fortifications, but were unable to reach the town itself. All the while, the Western group had attempted to flank Modane, but the French fortifications held strong. Even when all forces linked up to attack the town, they failed to reach it. The closest they got was when an advanced Italian unit reached just 3 kilometers outside Modane. The French held out until the armistice could be signed, denying the Italians Modane or their ultimate goal of Albertville. Italian forces were able to advance nearly 15 kilometers during these attacks, but had not reached their objective. During these advances, the Italians were cold, hungry, and had low morale on the front. These conditions left some Italians unwilling to fight, and although they had double the amount of soldiers as the French, they were unable to make a meaningful breakthrough. The Italians' outdated equipment also did not help with this problem. Even in late June, the Alps were extremely cold, and soldiers had to dig holes in the snow in order to stay safe from the wind. Additionally, demolished bridges and hidden French machine gun posts cost the Italians many casualties. Throughout the 15-day campaign, both the Italians and the Allies bombed each other's strategic points. The Italian bombing of French fortifications was ineffective because the forts were built to withstand heavy bombing and were partially buried in the mountainside. they dropped over 276 metric tons of bombs between when they entered the war and when France surrendered. The Italian Air Force lost many fighters, largely due to their outdated CR-42 model that usually struggled against more modern monoplanes. The unsuccessful siege of Malta also began during this period after the Italians declared war on the Allies. On June 24th, the Franco-Italian Armistice was signed and came into effect the following day. The armistice resulted in a demilitarized zone up to 50 kilometers west of the Franco-Italian border, as well as demilitarized zones in various French colonies. Italy would occupy all territory captured during their 15-day campaign, which was only 832 square kilometers big and held 28,500 residents. A large Italian occupation zone would result in a larger garrison, which Italy could not sustain as they needed to divert resources to other fronts of the war. Mussolini got his few thousand casualties all right. Over 3,800 Italian soldiers were either killed, wounded, or missing, with another 2,000 suffering from frostbite. Mussolini had predicted the war would be over by now, but in reality, Italy had to sustain a war for another 5 years. He had brought his unprepared country into a war that would cost hundreds of thousands of more lives. This failed invasion of France suggested that more disastrous Italian military campaigns would develop throughout the war, and they did.